We're going to be focusing on planning for success by creating learning targets. Not just any learning targets, but aligned learning targets. It's important to note that this is part 3 of a 3-part series. In part 1, we focused on identifying priority standards. In part 2, we unpacked the standard, but then we also leaned heavily into deconstructing the standard. Now we're shifting to creating aligned learning targets. Before we dive deep into the work of actually creating an aligned learning target, it's important that we get some background knowledge on what is a learning objective or a learning target. A learning objective should describe specifically what students should know or be able to do at the end of a lesson. The objective must be clear to students. Students should know exactly what they are learning. The learning objective should serve as a meaningful goal or a path toward mastery for students. It should be something new, something that students were unable to do prior to that lesson. It's also imperative that we note that a learning objective or a learning target, it's not just a compliance piece of your lesson planning process. It's not just posted on the board for students to copy down. No, the learning target or learning objective is an imperative piece of your planning practices and of your instruction. Your students should be able to identify from that learning target where they're going. You should include that learning target as part of your hook when you're introducing your particular lesson. And if you're fearful that some of the language that's used your students may struggle with, then that gives you a great opportunity to expose them to academic language or academic vocabulary with teacher support. Go over that learning target or learning objective. Give your students context behind what they're going to be learning during that time of instruction. When you're crafting a learning target, points to consider. Think back to when you unpack a standard. You got to identify the noun or the noun phrase for what you want students to learn. Determine the level of learning students should achieve. And identify an aligned verb. I often suggest that teachers use Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge. There is no reason to reinvent the wheel and to pull words out of thin air. We have great bodies of research and work at our fingertips. Use them and keep the learning objective clear, concise, and challenging. Challenging, why? Because you're there to support your students towards mastery. So a lot of what we just talked about does anchor back to part 2 of this series, unpacking and deconstructing a standard. In the process of unpacking a standard, you know the rubric for it. You're identifying the nouns, the verbs, and the concept. What is going to be covered? What's the big idea of that standard? So when you think about, hey, I've deconstructed, I've unpacked, now it's time to live in this phase, the phase of creating your learning objectives. So now let's create an aligned learning target. This visual may support you in really understanding the process associated with creating an aligned target. We have to be mindful of the level of knowledge necessary. How will you do that? Look at the student expectation. Look at the standard. What verb is included? Is the verb analyze included? Is the verb compare included? Determine, identify, predict. Whatever verbs are included in the knowledge statement or the skill, make certain that you're leveraging that. If you don't want to use the verb that's included in the student expectation or in the standard, if you don't want to use analyze, if you don't want to use compare, that's okay. But you need to find a verb that is aligned to that level of rigor or extends past that level of rigor. How do you do that? If it were me and my coaching, I'm coaching people to use Webb's depth of knowledge or Bloom's taxonomy. Yes, you can create words and pull them from thin air, but the work has been done for you. Use the resources that are available at your fingertips. And then, as a reminder, clear is kind. When you're crafting a learning objective or a learning target for students, make it clear, make it concise, and make it specific. So let's dive into the work now. I've chosen to use the same standards that I used during part 2 of this series, which is a 5th grade reading standard, 5.8B and 5.6F. These are Texas state standards. You can already see if you're familiar with unpacking a standard or unpacking a knowledge and skill statement. You see where I've identified my verbs, my nouns, and the big ideas or the concepts. They're there for us. We know we have analyze. Analyze what? Relationships and conflicts of who or of what among characters. Make what? Make inferences. And do what? Use evidence to support understanding. Now remember, in part 2 of this series, we deconstructed this standard and took it all the way back down to its base. So if you want more support with that piece, go back to part 2 of this series. But let's move forward with unpacking the standard. It's done. And now let's continue to create that aligned learning objective. So I want you to read the learning target that I've crafted. Identify genre characteristics and annotate what? Annotate text evidence of a what? A fictional text. Is that specific? Yes. The students know that they have to identify genre characteristics and annotate text evidence of a what? Of a fictional text. To do what? To support in the analysis of the relationships and conflicts among who? Among the characters. Go back up to 5.8b. Does it say among characters? Yes, it does. Among the characters. To do what? Look at 5.6f. To infer how the main character felt. I have analyze, I have annotate, I have identify. Have I pulled in conflicts, relationships, inference, and text evidence? I have. This would be an aligned learning target. I cannot create, or I would have extreme difficulty creating an aligned learning objective or learning target if I did not first unpack the standard. But even more so, if I did not yank that standard apart to its base level by deconstructing it. Those two processes are essential prior to getting to this part, the learning objective. And remember, this isn't just a compliance measure. This is something that truly guides your instructional consideration. Now let's tie it all together. In part 1, we identified focus standards. In part 2, we unpacked and we deconstructed the standard. And just now in part 3, we created aligned learning targets. Call to action. Be intentional about planning practices. They truly do impact the scholar and the student's learning experiences. Create a crosswalk between what is already going really well on your campus and look at how it can be enhanced or elevated by adding new skills or new ideas or new tools. If you find that you're grappling with how do I add something to my toolkit where I already feel I'm pretty proficient, consider watching Embracing the Double Pedal, where we talk deeper about how can we really approach challenges or new things as a way of opportunity instead of always looking at it from the lens of challenge. And make certain to provide context. Context is necessary to help others around you to embrace the value of these new practices. Model these practices. There is no way that someone can appropriately deconstruct a standard after the first time that they've seen it modeled. There's no way that someone can create an aligned learning objective off the chart, tier 1, perfectly done, good verbs, wonderful nouns, and great concepts. It takes time. Be patient with yourself and with others. And as always, as an instructional leader for excellence, action, and development, support, support, support. I'm Misty Green with iLead Consulting. I would love to connect with you. Please find me on Twitter at Misty Green iLead. Until next time.